I'm going to pass you over to Paul Lowe, who is Senior Lecturer in Photography at the University of the Arts in London, and he's going to be moderating tonight's event, so I hope you enjoy it.
Great. I'm not going to say very much to begin with, but thank you all for coming, obviously. The format for tonight is we're going to show a 12-minute film about Panos, which talks quite a lot about Panos' history and kind of where Panos is today. And then we're going to hopefully open up a discussion about what the future of Panos and indeed the future of what we do as photographers is going to be. But we're also going to have two short presentations by Andrew Testa and Chloe Dewe Mathews about their work, and they're going to join us on the panel afterwards. So the film's about 12 minutes, the lights will go down for that, and then we'll all come up onto Andrew and Chloe will do their presentations, and then the four of us will come up, and we'll probably have a few discussion between us, and then we'll open it up for questions. When we open it for questions, we are going to have a roving mic, but please do wait for the microphone, and if you can say who you are when you ask your question, and the whole thing is being filmed and recorded, so that's why you need to wait for the microphone, otherwise the audio won't be there. So thank you very much, and I think we'll show the film.
Documentary's expanded so much.
Exactly.
I think the kind of work that I've been doing recently wouldn't have been called documentary 15 years ago, and now it fits within the umbrella of documentary.
No, it's exactly the same, I think. I still do trips on my credit card. I get some commissions and balance the two out.
The stories that people can tell to put with your visuals, I think can be a fantastic addition.
I no longer see a distinction really between going out and taking pictures of the world and going out and taking pictures from the world.
It's 25 years since Panos Pictures was founded as the commercial arm of the Panos Institute, an environment and development NGO. And it's that relationship that we have with the Panos Institute that has coloured what we've done over the last 25 years. The issues we choose to cover, our approach, the way we work. We sit between the not-for-profit world and the for-profit world, and it's that space that we occupy that makes us unique.
It didn't appeal to me at all to be in a scrum of news photographers. I did it a few times, I hated it. What always appealed to me was being out on my own. And this kind of thing I got because I was not around other photographers. Very much somebody who likes to be out there documenting. I'm interested in history. So
Well, this is a piece of history.
that's it, it's a historic photo. I think that's what I feel about it. It is a piece of history, yeah, and I was very lucky to get it.
It wasn't aggressive, but it was slightly jeering. This picture was taken in 1986, before the 87 general election. It was against a background of recession, post-miners' strike, post the big shake-up of the media with Murdoch at Wapping. When I look at that picture now, there's something wonderfully naive about it, in that that is a Prime Minister in a controlled walkabout that was basically hijacked by real life. I couldn't take it today. For a still photographer to be able to stand back and get a clean picture of real people with a leading politician in a real world situation is practically impossible.
Actually going back 20 years, 25 years, there was less, certainly, construction of images within the broad area of photojournalism.
Was it a bit one-dimensional? And now that's not good enough?
With the benefit of hindsight, it's one-dimensional. We didn't think at the time, oh my God, this is one-dimensional. It's what we knew and what we did. But now we realise that there are so many more dimensions that you can work with in documentary and photojournalism.
And you have to be a bit more considered and conceptual, maybe.
Well, I think so, because so many things have been done before. Just because something's been done before is not an argument for not doing it again. But I think if you are going to do it again, you have a duty to try and do it differently.
Yeah. I mean, a good example of that is looking at Tim Hetherington's Liberia and the graffiti in Liberia. Now, we know that Tim did do some kind of more classic storytelling type photographs. But this edit, which he's very into himself, is the graffiti. And not only is that interesting because it is this whole idea of aftermath kind of photography, but without having the people in, but you have this very personal, because it is essentially handwriting or scarring of the walls. I mean, does that tell you more? I mean, that's, I guess, the question is, how does that work?
I have to use my imagination. What are the ramifications of that thing that you're seeing? Because there are ramifications way beyond what's in the frame. As you've got more and more of the photographer in their own work, that also is reflected in the way that photojournalism has moved somewhat away from the editorial market, or is less dependent on the editorial market now. And of course, within the editorial market, you have very little control over what you produce.
If you were to ask how I define myself now, I would simply say a photographer. But if I look at how my income is generated, I'm more an artist than a photojournalist. I mean, I get my money, apart from grants, it is more from print sales and exhibition fees than from publications. And I think the last time I had an assignment from a magazine must have been about 5 years ago. There are two main lines. If you look at my work of the last 10 years or so, and one is a worldwide comparison of elements that are vital in society, yet that very few people would photograph because they don't seem to be very photogenic. If you would drop all the other reasons why it's interesting to look at bureaucracy, it's also a very interesting way to portray a country.
The approach we take at Panos towards photographing in other parts of the world, particularly in somewhere like Africa, where photojournalists invariably make the mistake of either being Afro-pessimists or Afro-romantics. But there's this whole middle area that is ignored.
When you have a story that's actually about something more specific than just trying to cover a country or a conflict, as you look at an individual or you look at a certain event, but as maybe metaphor or representation of a bigger picture, it actually has more effect.
I won the Luis Valtuena Humanitarian Photography Award, which is run by Médicos del Mundo, a Spanish NGO. The prize was a grant to cover one of their projects anywhere in the world. So they immediately presented me with a map and showed me their projects all over the world, and I saw Western Sahara instantly. And it was always a place that I was interested in Africa, because it's so obscure and so out of the media spotlight, that I said, yes, this is where I want to go. I didn't have any preconceived ideas. I mean, I really thought I could do something interesting during the day. The idea was a reaction to the situation I found, and I was just really shocked by, first of all, the numbers, and secondly, just how forgotten they are, you know. Nobody really knows that these people are there. I think it was after 3 or 4 days, I just thought, you know, I mean, it's like they're living in darkness here. Like, it's one long night for these people. So why don't I just shoot it all at night time? When I had the idea, it just instantly felt right.
There was a neighbourhood not far from where I lived in Kabul, which had a really busy bus station across from the main courthouse. And at that bus station, there were about a half-dozen box cameras set up. These large wooden boxes sitting on top of very heavy, rather awkward tripods. As I was chatting with one of the photographers and watching the people as they came to sit to have their photos taken, I decided I wanted to see what the camera looked like on the inside, because the photographer kept opening the small door on the back of the camera, and I was really just curious. So when I looked inside, there was this amazing, beautifully lit reflection of the person who was having their portrait taken on the glass, on the inside of the camera. I wanted to add some color to the background, because the background the photographers were using was always black, and that seemed just dull to me. I decided to use the chadors, the headscarves that women in Afghanistan wear. Those you can pretty much get at any market. I bought many different colors and I used them as a backdrop, and I also used my own headscarf, and this is where it actually gets kind of tricky. What I did was I let the light filter through the headscarf to get the colored reflected light, the kind of blurred light that you see on the glass.
I think, collaborations, certainly in the way I work, are a very powerful way of putting a message across. We couldn't physically go down into the mine, that was clear. But obviously, the footage that was coming out, there was some great stuff, but it was all edited and controlled by the government. So we really wanted to kind of see, from a first-person perspective, some really kind of unedited, raw footage, And there's only one way you could do it, and that was obviously through sending the camera down there. All the guys in the team were very clear that we didn't really want to give Edison any instructions. We had the camera down there for about 3 weeks, and we hadn't received the SIM card back up. We hadn't got it. The day before he got out, and this is when we really knew that they believed they were going to escape, he sent it up inside a pair of socks, and we got it. And seeing this guy who, obviously was tormented, but was finding his own way to deal with it, finding his own way through running for miles and through pulling, bits of machinery around the mines. And so by the time I actually got back to Santiago and then flew to New York, the pictures were already flying out all over the place, and it was just unbelievable the distance that they went. And it was fantastic to see that, Panos were able to get them in front of so many people across the world.
It's kind of, I love that idea of photography being a bit like pointing at something, because you're saying, no, don't look over there, look over there. Yeah. And that's what Mishka Henner seems to do, is he's constantly just choosing what to point at.
Exactly. No Man's Land is a body of work that presents what appear to be a number of sex workers in and around Europe, all captured by Google Street View. Somebody is driving a car along these roads with a camera mounted on top of the car, which automatically takes 9 pictures every few seconds, all at different angles. I'm simply coming along and choosing one of those viewpoints and framing the shot so that it works. And in that sense, I see myself as working as a photographer. Google Street View in itself doesn't tell a story. It needs people to interpret it. It needs people to make sense out of the huge, vast amount of images that it produces. And I think that that's what I'm doing with No Man's Land. We kind of live in an era where the search engine is almost our main interface with the world. We kind of we gather information about the world, we learn things, we look for things through the search engine. And so for me it makes perfect sense to work as a photographer using the search engine.
Great, thank you very much. So Andrew's going to go first, and then Chloe.
Hi everyone, I'm Andrew Testa, been with Panos since 1999, and I thought I'd show you some the work from Kosovo, which kind of fits with the time. This started when I joined Panos. I think I've got a mic on, have I? Can you hear me? No? A bit. That's all you'll need. So this was before search engines were our main interface. So this was me with my camera. So I started in Kosovo in 1998. So as we progress, you'll see how the work changed. But this is when I first joined Panos. Went to Kosovo with the Observer and the Guardian, initially to cover the war. Initially shooting black and white and colour film, covering the fighting between the ethnic Albanian Kosovo Liberation Army and the Serbs. Can you can't hear me?
When you speak up, we can.
Oh, okay. So, I mean, this photograph, this will reference to a photograph later. This is, you know, I've been going back to Kosovo 12, 13 years now, and I just came back from the trip a couple of weeks ago. Partly that's because I got married over there, so I have that link. But that enables me to sort of look at things in depth. This photograph is the first anniversary of the death of someone who became a mythological figure in the eyes of the Albanians. He was a commander of the KLA who was killed by the Serbs. So when I started in Kosovo, this was kind of in the heart of the war. This is a group of men who have been separated from the women. They were they were hiding out from Serb shelling. They were taken away, and the women and children left. This is the blood of a Serb who was killed in a firefight. I actually lost pretty much all these photographs of scans made from film. And I managed to lose all the film. This was the ethnic cleansing of Pristina, so this is at the border with Macedonia. All my film from that time was lost in two separate incidents, unfortunately. One, a journalist I'd been working with was trying to leave Kosovo and he was stopped at the border. And then when the NATO bombing began in 1999, other journalists who were trying to get our film out were stopped. So I lost all of this film. All I've got is the scans. So this is something that's really changed now. I mean, this is not a problem we have now, but the story here. There's the boy you see here. This was a refugee, a queue of refugees in Albania, queuing for food. And I mean, I was struck by the boy in the photograph, and about 10 years later, I got an email from an art gallery in Berlin, and they were asking me to contact him because he was from the refugee camp. He was spotted by an Italian psychologist because this boy could draw simultaneously with both hands, and he's gone on. He was sent to school in Italy, and he's gone on to become this very well-known artist who led the Berlin Biennale last year. So, you know, by being in Kosovo and by sticking around, you know, these stories come back, and this was a really nice story to, you know, really nice thing to happen. This photograph was one of the photographs that I was really proud to make in Kosovo because we were hearing all the time during the war about men with masks coming into the villages and carrying out the massacres. And you know, obviously during the war in Kosovo, it was such a long time ago now, but it was very difficult to verify any of that because no one could get access. This was actually just after NATO came into Kosovo. I went in with NATO, and we came across this column of Serbian paramilitaries leaving. And luckily for me, there was a British tank very close by, so I was able to go next to the British tank and get this photograph. But for me, it really it was an important photograph to get because it just gave a little bit of backup to all those stories that we'd been hearing the whole time. That you know, these guys did exist. You know, they were in the bandanas, the masks. They were going in and committing the massacres. So I mean, historically, this was a very important photograph for me. So this is post-war now. And it's pretty important for me that, I mean, I think in media terms, and a lot in the British media, we kind of have this attitude that, you know, once the UN go in, then everything's finished, and you know, it's time to go home. I mean, the column inches given to Libya during the fighting, and then, you know, all of a sudden it completely drops off. I mean, I really think that staying longer in a place, covering the aftermath. I mean, in Kosovo, you had this incredible time after the war. This is a Serbian family. You had this so many revenge attacks going on against the Serbian minority who were left in Kosovo after the war, and what happened after the war was just as important as what happened during the war, and I think we often forget that. And you know, after the war in Kosovo, it was kind of an orgy of violence, really. This was a commander of the rebel army who was killed, probably by his colleagues, because he was he wanted to work with the West United Nations presence there more than they did, or it was a power struggle. But there was all this stuff happening after the war that really needed covering. This was a series I did on a train that was provided for the Serbs and the Roma to travel through Kosovo. This was the only way they could safely travel through Kosovo for many years. This is another religious ceremony at Gazimastan, which ties back to, in Kosovo, the Serbs' kind of base. A lot of their stuff dates back to 1389, when they lost the battle with the Turks, or they perceived that they lost the battle with the Turks, and lost Kosovo. And every year they come back to the battlefield at Gazimastan, and they have this religious service. But I mean, to anyone who's covered the Balkans, you have the 4 Cs there, which we've all seen from when you go through the ethnically cleansed villages. They used to spray this. It means only unity saves the Serbs. So I mean, this photograph it ties into the whole psyche of the Serbs during the Balkan Wars, where it was very much state-sanctioned. They had the backing of the religious leaders for what they were doing. This is in the build-up to independence. Just on the top here, you have Vedvendosia, Yo Negotiata, which means self-determination, basically. So there was a group going around Pristina, spraying this all over the town. I mean, what I've realised when as I've been covering Kosovo is that because I was there during those things that were happening, and I still see it through that prism. I got an email a few years ago from someone who was seeing my work and said, "I can't believe it's the same place. I see it as I see Kosovo as a party place now." But I realised that I still see it through the prism of covering the war. And when I drive around, I still see the checkpoints. I see it in that, and a lot of my photography in Kosovo now is it's still trying to come to terms with that sort of change in the landscape. And this was a series I started in 2006. This is a swimming pool used exclusively by ethnic Albanians. So in Kosovo after the war, you still have this distinction between the two communities, and these lines which exist. They're not set in stone. There's nothing physical about them. But this swimming pool is very, very close to where this unspoken line exists between the Albanian and the Serb communities. So I'm just looking with this series of pictures. I was just looking at a way of showing the divisions that still exist in the society, and also trying to tie it into the landscape. And also because Kosovo was just set to become the newest country in Europe. Now, if you remember the photograph I had of the anniversary of Adam Yashari, this is the same event 8 years later, when the ethnic Albanian leadership had made the death of this commander into a huge part of the mythology of ethnic Albanian independence in Kosovo. Every time he was, you could kind of see the myth being built. He was always, every time his name was mentioned, he was referred to as the legendary commander, and it was just interesting to see this whole mythology built up around him. And interestingly, this night at his village, this was in 2006. They were getting about 50,000 people every year to attend this ceremony honouring his death. Now that peaked with independence, and now after independence, it's almost as if he was used up until independence was gained, and then he's kind of been discarded a little bit. And now you're seeing that this is tailing off, and it's just interesting to see that how the leadership in Kosovo kind of using things using his image and his name to kind of encourage feelings of nationalism and get independence, and then now it's kind of the kind of discarded him. This was a series on the missing that I started, which I'm now carrying on. These were photographs that were placed outside the parliament in Pristina by the relatives of the missing, and they were there for a few years, so they were getting destroyed in the rain and the wind and the sun, and so I went and photographed them as they were being destroyed, just to show that the passing of time and how things were not being resolved in a quick way. And at the end of the war, there were 5,500 missing in Kosovo, and now there's still 1,800 missing. So it's a really, and I've started photographing the mothers of the missing, and it's really interesting to talk to them, because for them time is completely frozen. This is a shot that I took of a photograph. This was how the missing, this was an incident, the Serbian regime tried to take the bodies of the ethnic Albanians from the massacres and bury them in Serbia, but some of the drivers lost their nerve, and this driver tried to sink his truck in the Danube. Luckily for us, in 2001, Milosevic fell, and we were able to go in and talk to the new government, and the police chief showed me these photographs of. He showed me this one of the truck. This was full of bodies of ethnic Albanians. They then, after they admitted that they had the mass graves, they then started bringing the bodies back to Kosovo for reburial, so they would bring 40 or so bodies back every month. This is people walking past the body bags. This is a reburial. But for the mothers of the missing, it's almost as if they're frozen in time. I mean, the whole world, it's now 13 years since the Kosovo War. And things have moved on for everyone. Even in Kosovo, everything's moved on. But for these mothers, everything's frozen. And what, you know, the killing of their children, which probably did, you know, probably the murderer didn't even, or the soldier who killed them, or the paramedic or whoever, it probably didn't even trouble him for more than a few seconds. But for them, their lives stopped at that point. And you find with all these women, this woman, her husband, her 3 sons were taken, so her entire family, and she's made her life a little. The house is now a shrine to her loved ones. This is the room of one of the boys, but their lives are still frozen. They can't kind of move on, and so I'm just kind of investigating that at the moment. That's it. Chloe, oh, hold on. I'm connected.
Hello everyone, I'm Chloe Dewe Mathews. I joined Panos 1 year ago, last summer. Let me know, can you hear me by the way? Yeah, okay. So yeah, I joined about a year ago, and up until then I was assisting sometimes, doing some of my own commissions, and I'll just take you through a few projects that I think show what I've been up to. This first piece is called Hasidic Holiday, and it's a piece I shot in Aberystwyth on the Welsh coast, where the Hasidic Jewish communities from all over Britain, so Manchester, London, and in fact even people from Jerusalem and New York came, and they come for this 2-week period to Aberystwyth just to relax and have a holiday, and they rent the university accommodation on the hill that's obviously vacated for the summertime. And I was really delighted by the whole thing happening, and I had heard, because I was in Aberystwyth anyway, and had heard, oh, when are the Jews coming? And I thought, what, you know, which Jews? And then I found out that they come every year, and I suppose partly the fact that it's on this sort of Victorian seafront, seeing these black figures sort of majestically wandering along, it did recall images from the past. But also, I thought really interesting to sort of just see a little bit about their relationships to one another and the really strong sense of family that when I think of other photo stories from sort of towns in Wales, a lot of it's to do with, you know, drunkard teenagers and all sorts of things. So it was nice just to see more of a family thing going on. And this is in fact the synagogue that's set up temporarily for the 2 weeks in the middle of all this university accommodation. And it was really a piece that I did just 2 years, 2 summers, whilst I was assisting, and a sort of way of me forging, trying to find a way of photographing things that I found particularly interesting. I didn't really know if anyone else would find it that interesting, but I just thought if you focus on things that genuinely interest yourself, then hopefully that will sort of come through. So the other piece that I was also doing at that time was a piece called Banger Boys of Britain, and that I discovered just with my boyfriend one day going to Wimbledon. There's a stadium there which they do greyhound racing and also banger racing, and immediately I knew I wanted to do a photo story about it. People go, they make up these cars, so they buy a banger car. I mean, a lot of people are actually mechanics or work in scrapyards, and they do up these cars in a very sort of just practical, just getting on with it way. They just shove these cars together, take out all the stuff in the centre, just leave the one seat, take out all the windows, and then they put a bit of reinforcement on them, and then they race them around these tracks on the weekends and smash them to pieces. And there was something so joyful about it, so sort of carnivalesque, you know. It was just this wonderful celebration of just being able to put something together and then smash it, and you really get the sense when all the people in the who are watching, you really get the sense that they're all lusting after this moment where they're seeing them all going around and they're thinking, oh, you know, what's going to happen and who's going to smash into who, and then suddenly when you get a smash, everyone's just gleeful and laughing, and it's so wonderful. And there's this shared sort of gladiatorial thing, I suppose, that everyone just wants to see the moment of destruction. And I thought that was really wonderful as an idea, having spent so much time lovingly doing up these cars, just the sort of create and destroy mentality that I identified with. And also I love the resourcefulness there, you know, in a time when everyone, there's this sort of, you know, wasteful consumerism, the fact that you were just sort of putting together, you were making do and cobbling things together, and then doing that, people would spray them up in different colours, put their girlfriend's name, the sort of hair salon that they worked at, all sorts of things. And it was a sort of wonderful community that I really enjoyed spending time photographing. So I'd be spending my weekends doing that, going to Wimbledon, to Aldershot, Eastbourne, all sort of around the southeast. Then I decided that I wanted to do a sort of major trip. My boyfriend and I decided that we wanted to do a trip that would go from east to west, and that would be able to sort of to experience that cultural shift that happens from east to west, these sort of big, you know, rich cultures and with amazing histories. We wanted to be able to physically experience that change. So we decided to hitchhike and camp from Xinjiang in China back to Britain. So as you can see, I've sort of put some dots in, which is really where I was taking photographs. I'm going to show you just 2 pieces from that trip, which are the more sort of consolidated pieces. But really, I think both of us saw this whole journey as a sort of as a self-education and as something that would be relevant to both of our work, you know, going forward. And actually, perhaps even if we didn't make anything that interesting or relevant on that trip, it wouldn't matter, because just the journey itself was going to be so important in, I suppose, an understanding. And actually, I think that also in hindsight, as much as it taught us about those various countries, it also really instilled a sense of Britain and things that are interesting and different about being here. So I think it's really informed my work back in Britain as well. So this is a piece I did called China's Wild West, which is about the Uyghur minority living in Western China. And there were riots in 2009, bloodshed and lots of things in the media. And we went afterwards when everything was very quiet, but you just heard little stories here and there of people saying, you know, my uncle disappeared or my brother was beaten up in an internet shop. And I suppose what I wanted to do was convey that latent aggression and threat that was there all the time, despite the fact that the more you know, frontline stuff has, frontline news things had sort of disappeared. This was a moment that we just wandered past, where there was a young Uyghur boy who was in the water in Kashgar, and he was screaming up to this policeman saying, "Oh, you threw me in, you threw me in," and we were wondering, you know, what exactly had happened. And I think that it was unsure who had done what, but the point is, for me, it really demonstrated that sense of the constant tension between the two cultures, and that there were these little happenings all the time. So that's what I was trying to convey, was really a more sort of everyday story. And then now onto a piece called Caspian, which is all based around the Caspian Sea, which I'm continuing at the moment. So I've just been to Russia to do the next phase of it. But this series you'll see now is from Kazakhstan and from Azerbaijan. This first small story is a piece about people bathing in crude oil as a health remedy. And this is a sanatorium where people come from all over the country, and now it's becoming a bit of a trend that people can come from Moscow, and, you know, as more of a sort of cosmetic choice, I suppose, to have lovely luscious skin. But actually what it's prescribed for is for bone and skin diseases, so psoriasis or rheumatism. And I think for me it was just so unbelievable that to see people doing this, that it really felt like the whole world had gone mad, you know, with your sort of associations of, you know, birds crawling out of the slick and this awful, terrible, you know, the terrible global oil industry, the sort of evil and corruption and all sorts of things. And then to see it as this health remedy, it felt, I suppose, was sort of what, for me, photography can do, which is just slightly make you rethink your associations with someone or something. And to find that this oil has been, in fact, bathed in for centuries, since Marco Polo's time. It's actually written about in his diaries. So then I just continued, or we continued, exploring the shores, seeing more everyday life, things going on, and people being drawn to the coastline to perform their daily rituals. And then another thing that we came across, because part of hitchhiking was really to try and get as involved in each country and the culture and the people as we could, as quickly as possible, because we were only really about a month in each country because of the visas. You can only get a month visa as a tourist. So it was an amazing way of just, you know, talking to people and getting in someone's car, and really, I suppose, although the digital revolution is a great excitement and wonderful in many ways, I think that so often people, you know, look to the internet for research too quickly. And I think to actually just go and talk to people and say, what do you enjoy doing, or where do you go, and whatever else, and ask questions, for me, that felt like a much more satisfying way to work. and in fact, I think it brought about some good stories. So this is a cemetery which is on the Kazakh coast, and you can see the huge mausoleum that has been constructed as a result of this new oil-rich middle class. There's this sort of thirst for the very showy, beautiful, engraved mausoleums, and there's, for that reason, Uzbek migrant workers who have come and they live in these sort of battered cabins in order to make the most of this sort of oil boom. And for me, it was just, again, it was a small story that was representative of a bigger thing going on, which tends to be the way I work, because it's sort of the way that I can understand things. And, you know, as we all know, there's a certain type of image that you see again and again, and so therefore it's very difficult to respond to, even if it's such an important issue. You just can't deal with it. So for me, it's all about finding small things that I am moved by personally. And yeah, to see this area that I know there's been a lot of work made or discussion about the sort of identities after the fall of the USSR, as to how their identities would be forged, to see people actually etching the symbols of the oil industry into their graves, to the memorials to their dead, was really striking. And here they are just sleeping in the open air, just next to the cemetery, so they're actually living within the cemetery walls for probably 4 months of the year. And that's it. Thank you. Ooh, attached. Shall I keep it on? Yeah.
Great. So happy birthday, Panos. 25
Thank you.
years. Long time in show business, I guess they say. But I mean, you know, in the film you talk a little bit about the past. How much has the industry changed in that 25 years? I mean, is it been a gradual process, or is it absolutely totally different now to how it was when you started all that time ago?
It's been gradual, but it's totally different. I mean, it's a different landscape. It's like being in a different country. I mean, even just starting from a very, very practical and boring point is that we've gone from an analog world to a digital world. So that in itself is a massive change, and has made it both easier and more difficult to work. And there's pros and cons. I think that the other major change is the way that the photo economy works, how any of you support yourselves. Interesting to see in the film that we saw 4 bodies of work: Jan Banning's Bureaucrats, Lana's Afghan Women, Andrew Sarawi's, the Edison Pena pictures from the Chilean mine. None of those pictures were actually supported by editorial commissions. And if you go back 25 years, a photojournalist would, their first port of call when they thought, I want to do a project, I want to go and do a story, they'd go to a magazine or a newspaper. And that magazine or newspaper would give them enough funds to go out and shoot a full, a complete project. That just doesn't happen now. Magazines and newspapers are still important, maybe for different reasons, maybe now more for disseminating stories than for actually funding you for the work you want to do. And so there's a very different mix in the way in which photographers support themselves. And I think that affects how photographers work. And what's different about us as well is that we have always, as I say in the film, we are a commercial photo agency, but we're part owned by an NGO, a non-government organisation, a charity that works on issues around environment and development, and particularly with media capacity building. And it's meant that we've never really even though we do a lot of current affairs, we're not a news gathering organisation. That means that we can therefore step aside from the main news agenda. In fact, both Chloe and Andrew have pursued stories when they have not been at the centre, under the media spotlight.
That seems to be a kind of defining feature of what Panos is interested in, this sense of telling stories about the world, important stories, but not being dictated to by a kind of stereotyped agenda of, of the major news magazines.
Exactly. And also being able to take a stand, because we're not politically allied to any political line, but we're not afraid of taking a stance, of taking a stand. And I mean, all photography is subject. I mean, when we get down to it, and Harry made that very good point. Photography is the idea of don't look over there, look over there. So at its most basic, photography is making a choice anyway. And then when you build that up, we are choosing to cover stories that we think are important.
So there's a certain kind of ethical component to Panos's position. How does that actually work in practice in terms of the assignments you choose to do, the projects you take on, the projects you think about doing?
I mean, at the very bottom line of all of this is that because we're part of an NGO, profits we make, half those profits are covenanted back to the NGO. It does influence what we choose to photograph. I think that, in a way, we like to sort of poke around in corners where other people don't go. Martin Adler, Panos photographer who sadly died a number of years ago, was killed in Somalia, said that he wanted to go to places where other people didn't want to go to and talk to people that other people didn't want to talk to. And I kind of think that's where we're coming from. It does mean also that we really focus down on social issues. We don't, you can see from the kind of work we do, it doesn't mean it's all heavy and depressing, and we like light stories as well, but we're very clearly focused on what we do, and we're not going to suddenly change and go off and do
Andrew, you made that point very clearly about Kosovo, the big debt in 1999 when all the world's media was there.
Sure.
But now nobody's interested. So how do you sustain working on a long-term basis in somewhere like that where there aren't any assignments, the newspapers aren't interested, the magazines aren't interested? What ways do you get your work out, and how do you get your work seen in a context like that?
Well, it's difficult. I mean, the last trip I did, I was working with Soros on something, so I took the opportunity while I was there to stay a little longer and then do some more work on start this sort of thing, looking again at the missing. But in general, up until 2005, up until 2008, it wasn't that hard because there was still interest in Kosovo. But I mean, the Balkans now is a dead subject. I mean, you probably know that yourself. So it's tough. I mean, you have to sort of piggyback it on the back of something else, like do something for an NGO or whatever way you can get there. Just piggyback your own work on the top, and then try and put together the body of work and do it that way.
So unlike Andrew and I, where we grew up with the idea of an assignment being what you did 20 years ago, you're obviously starting relatively soon. I mean, do you even think about that? Is even that on your agenda, or are you just doing the projects you want to do the way you want to do them?
Yeah, it's not, and that's purely because I've never known that. So everyone talks about this golden age, and that's wonderful, but it's really not how I've ever worked. So therefore, I don't look to, I look to find a good story or to find something I want to photograph, and to find a means of doing that. And generally, I see that as earning money elsewhere and then hoping to pay back for it afterwards as well, if you see what I mean. So like taking on things from like a corporate portraits or sort of some I don't know, really boring things that just means that you're getting money, but it's quite a clear transaction. You're working, you're getting money for this, and then you're sort of putting it into something else, which I quite like. Whereas there's all the sort of crowdfunding stuff, which happens a lot now, and I find that a more tricky thing to get my head around as far as asking people for money. So, which is all going towards a good thing, but I suppose currently the way that I like working is earning money and then putting it towards the things that I believe in, and then also having quite a large idea of my life and my career, a sort of that I'm building towards something. So even if it's not paying off right now, that hopefully in 10 years' time, by shooting the type of work that I think is important, then you maybe get commissioned to do that sort of thing, or you get, other things as a result.
So Adrian, I mean, it seems clear that you're trying to challenge stereotypes. I mean, how consciously are you doing that in the projects that Panos perhaps takes on? Because you do quite a lot of big group projects with Panos. You know, is there an agenda you're really trying to promote? I mean, you talked all about the stereotype of African stories. You know, is that something you're really trying to challenge as consciously in the industry?
Yeah, but it's very difficult to do that, again, within a straightforward media environment. So the way in which, you know, when we come up, what we find ourselves increasingly doing is trying to come up with our own project ideas and then finding people that will fund it. And that means going out and working a lot. You know, we talk about NGOs all the time, and some photographers are talking about NGOs these days as if they've just discovered the fact that NGOs are out there. But they've always been absolutely key to what we do at Panos, being part of an NGO and always having probably worked more in that field than with the mainstream media. Mainstream media came to us kind of later on in our development in some ways. And it gives you more freedom as well. I mean, that's the other thing. So we will conceive an idea, go out there, find someone to fund it, produce it, deliver it, and also it's not just photography now. That's the other thing that we're finding now, that being a photographer or being a photo agent is actually a much more complicated thing than it was 25 years ago. I'm sure you'd agree. I mean,
so you're no longer servicing an industry by just providing image. You're actually more like a production company.
No, you're thinking. We're thinking like, what are we trying to say? Why are we trying to say it? Who is the audience? You know, and I think it's important that all photojournalists do that, and the thinking ones do. Chloe and Andrew, there are people that don't, but and then we do that for other organisations. But also, my point was about, it's so much more difficult to be a photographer. You just don't go out and shoot the pictures and deliver them. You have to be able to shoot video. You have to be able to record audio. You know, do web stuff. I mean, there's no end of things that you have to do, and you're getting paid the same amount of money as you used to. So it's
how significant is that kind of multimedia world now? Is it a flash in the pan? Is it a passing fad?
No, I think it's massively significant, because the technology allows you to do this stuff now. With a stills camera, you can shoot video. So if you can do it, then you will be asked to do it. But the problem is finding a funding model. Yeah. We're just doing a big project now with an NGO called International Rescue Committee, where we've, for the first time, been able to build into the assignments the photographer going with a multimedia producer, so that, you know, they can shoot the video, collect the audio. That's a new development, and I think the problem is that what we do is expensive. Quality journalism, quality photojournalism is expensive, and the media is not putting its hand in its pockets anymore.
Okay, so maybe we'll open up a little bit to some questions from the floor. Have we got the mic? Anybody got a question immediately? Anybody? No? There you go, Robert.
Adrian, just following up on your multimedia riff, the obvious outlet now is the web, as opposed to print.
Yeah.
And the problem, as you've also just said, is the funding model for the web isn't there yet, and The Guardian, whoever, doesn't really pay for the production of really high quality multimedia. But do you see some light or change coming, or education, or
I think you just have to educate your client base that this stuff, you need to pay for it. You just can't expect someone to and I think within an NGO, I mean, this is quite interesting as well, is that where we look now is you look at a process and you go, well, there's a message and you want to get the message out there. So do you go to the person that distributes the message for your funding, or do you go to the person that wants to get the message out there? And they have more of a vested interest in working with you in a way than the press does. And so I think that's the model that we'll be following. And there is money within campaigning organisations that there isn't within the media. You know, they're incredibly well funded.
Do you feel pressure to kind of go start shooting film and collecting audio, or are you trying to keep your practice fairly conventional photographic?
No, pressure is increasing, yeah. But I'm shooting Nikon, so it doesn't really work. Chris helped me with I did shoot something for the New York Times recently, and it's completely different. I mean, it's, you know, I'm used to. I don't want when I'm photographing something. I don't want to be seen. I want to be in the back. I don't want to affect what's happening in front of me in any way, shape, or form. But I find, you know, with video, you have to do that. You have to construct something. You have to tell somebody, you know, walk this way, do that, do that. You know, you're completely putting yourself you're walking into the scene, you're going to kind of tromping around with great big boots to get the shots you want. So it's completely different. So I don't know if I can see myself doing stills and video on the same thing. Maybe video here and then stills there. I don't know. We'll see how it goes.
Yeah, I feel similarly that there's certain projects that you can, that certainly in my sort of more long-term pieces, that it's really nice to say, okay, right now I'm going to go out and shoot some video and do some audio and stuff, but to try and do both things at the same time, it seems like it's got to be a compromise, you know. So I think it's a really valid, interesting way of sort of bringing more depth to your work, but not all the time, ideally.
So is this something that Panos has invested in terms of the learning curve? Because it's quite a steep learning curve.
We've invested in staff, in training. We've got two fantastic multimedia people over there somewhere here. I can see one, Valeria, and Anna. And it's an investment for the long term. I mean, we didn't put the money into that expecting to make the money back straight away, but then you build up a reputation for doing what you do, and there aren't that many people that actually specialise in multimedia. Yes, there's plenty of film companies, but multimedia is another whole other thing, really.
Chloe, I think you said something really interesting about the idea of relying too heavily on the web to provide insight and information about places you're going to photograph. And being there is a very different experience. The scent of a place, closing your eyes and feeling it is very different. And that's what the web, I think, robs us from. But just following on what the conversation is here, I think what photographers, still photographers, are being asked to be is a jack of all trade. You know, it used to be you dropped off your film someplace and it was debbed, and you looked at a contact sheet and you looked over a light box and you made some selections and moved on. And I think it's very difficult to do things with exquisite kind of execution and quality, to be a video expert, a film expert, to edit, to, you know, Final Cut. Someone says, well, I've got Final Cut on my computer. Have I ever turned it on? And the short answer is no, because I'm not qualified to do film editing. I have ideas. And I think what is being asked today of a photographer that is working in the photojournalistic mode is really far too much in terms of a stretch to get the excellence that is required. We can't be able to be expected to be absolute experts in film editing, as well as waiting for a moment that a picture is right and we feel good about something, and not actually going onto the web to find out whether Kosovo or London Heathrow is going to have an overcrowded border control, which I just experienced, which was 4 hours, and I don't even want to go there. And I think it's very different. I think what is being asked of all of us with a less and less money. I mean, I went to bed last night, 4 in the morning, just trying to get a short piece edited that I had to get out for a deadline. And it wasn't complicated, except there were so many other things that I was looking at, and I thought, I've lost the plot. I don't even, you know, and I'm not good enough. Like, should I rush it into Photoshop versus the idea of working with an expert printer, you know, that knew how to make everything sing with enormous beauty. I don't know how we do this anymore. I really, and cost effective. You know, I'll end up just hiring someone that can do post-production a hell of a lot better than I can. And so I don't know how all of you deal with it as well. And our coffers don't look very rich either, is the other problem.
But isn't the idea, therefore, that if you can collaborate, that's the sort of ideal thing?
Exactly.
And that, in fact, on the video, there was Adam Patterson. He was collaborating with, what's his name down the line?
Edison Pena.
Yeah, and that actually you should know your strengths and do what you're good at, and ask someone else who's better at something else to do that. But the point is just how you can work that out with the person that pays you. Will just say, will you do the whole lot? But I mean, surely it is the more intelligent way of doing things to collaborate. Yeah.
Well, you think of Tim Hetherington's work when he worked with his editor Maglia. She's great, and then you get the best of the best.
Yeah.
But you know, many NGOs just don't have that budget.
Right.
Certain media just looks at you blankly and said, you can't do a slideshow, you can't do the voiceover.
So Adrian, you find you have to educate the clients in
to educate
the realities of this.
And some photographers don't want to do video. It's fine, you know, they don't want to do it. They don't want to do it. But No, I've lost my train of thought, sorry.
Just say who you are as well, just so for the recording it's kind of nice if we know who everybody is.
Hello, I'm Lefteris, I'm a photographer. I just want to go back to what Adrian said before about the need to go back to the person or the people that they have a message to spread out, and the way that we can help take that out. And I just want to ask, you know, what do you feel about the notion that people say that this might be equals propaganda, so we ended up being propagandists? And on that case, where do you find your editorial integrity, and how can you protect you or your photographers on that?
Are you talking about working for NGOs, and that is like you're propagandists for NGOs? Is that it? Or I mean, there is an argument that that's the case.
Yeah, there is an argument.
You work for a media gathering organisation, or you work for an NGO, and they both have an agenda. And the NGOs do have agendas. There's no doubt about it. And they're very large and quite often quite powerful organisations. I think it's about establishing we work in partnership with them. It's a kind of a slightly different relationship in that when you're working in partnership, we're both trying to get to the same place, and we're helping them get to a certain place. But also making sure that you can get some creative freedom. So this project we're working on at the moment with ICR, IRC rather, they're having no input into the way in which we photograph and the material we gather.
I mean, it's naive to think that the world media is not propaganda and is innocent and naive and sort of not, you know, it's Fox Inc. It's Time Inc. at the end of the day.
I mean, would you rather work for Oxfam or Murdoch? I mean, it's you know.
I mean, there is an irony. Lots of us are very happy to have our work published in magazines. That the ownership of those magazines is, you know, probably quite anti the views that we. I always thought it was very funny when I started out. I worked for the Sunday Telegraph, and almost everybody that was working there in the photo department was a socialist worker member. So you had the most right-wing paper in Britain being, you know, the staff of which was almost entirely left-wing. So I think there's always been that tension between, you know, what a lot of photographers would espouse to in terms of their politics. And I think one of the problems with that is that many photographers don't actually stick with that. You know, they don't actually follow that through. And I guess that's what I was trying to imply earlier on with the question about Panos. You know, there are agencies that you know, espouse a humanitarian agenda and yet will work for major multinationals doing large advertising campaigns for companies that are effectively
which pays well, but
are effectively exploiting the very thing that they would be.
Exactly.
Yeah. We'll take a question here, then there, and then we'll go over there.
I'm Sam, interning at Panos. I had a question for Chloe. Just looking at your work and the stuff that you're talking about is obviously very personal to you in terms of what you want to photograph and how you get about photographing it. And I was just wondering if there's a serious divide, or with the stuff that you shoot in terms of what you were talking about, kind of obviously the bread and butter stuff and shooting corporately. And shooting the documentary side and the slower stuff. I was wondering if there's a big divide between the stuff you do to earn enough money to survive as a professional photographer.
Yeah, I'd say there's a massive difference, and I do all sorts of different things for the sort of money work, and I still really enjoy making something that looks nice, that has lovely light, and that person, you get a nice sense of that person. Like, I still enjoy that, but it's a much more simple process, and it doesn't involve me emotionally or ideologically or anything else. But, you know, I think there's nothing wrong with it. It's good to do, and it's also got wonderful closure. You know, you do it and you give it to them, and that's it. You don't think about it ever again. Whereas all these other projects, I'm thinking about what should I carry on, how should I do it, and you know. So it is completely different. But it's nice to be in a position that I can still work within photography for the more money work. You know, rather than having to do a different job and then the other stuff being on the side. And I mean, I do get paid for some of this stuff that I do, and I get assignments, and these get published in magazines, and that's all good. But it's just saying that you sort of need to supplement it, and I don't think you can rely on that.
Okay. Question at the back.
My name's Louise Thomas and I work for an NGO, International Development Agency Tier Fund. Given the collapse in the editorial market and the pressure to multi-skill and the cost of kit, where do you see yourself going when and if NGO budgets start getting squeezed?
We're always looking for new sources of funding. I mean, now, of course, there's this we haven't talked about, well, you mentioned it, but crowdsourcing. I'm not sure if there's really an economic model there by going out. It's almost basically going out and saying, give me money to do what I want to do. Grants, awards. I think photographers are almost like little NGOs in themselves, in that they have to develop proposal writing skills and be able to go out there in the same way as you would pitch a story editorially, but when you're pitching it for funding outside of the editorial market, it's a slightly different skill, I think. And you have to know what it is that funder's interested in, etc., etc. I mean, NGO budgets will be squeezed, but then I don't see NGOs stinting on communication. I mean, I think I see ever-growing communications departments in NGOs. It's absolutely mind-blowing, actually, sometimes, how big some of the, I'm sure that isn't the case at Tier Fund, but at some NGOs that I know, they have vast communication departments.
So there's a question over here, and then we'll come here, and then we'll go. In fact, we'll go there, and then because the mic will be nearby, go to you, and then whoever it was just had their hand behind. Okay, so we'll go to the gentleman. Well, the gentleman here was first, I think, and then we'll go to you, and then we'll come across.
Hi, Russell Watkins from the Department for International Development, picture editor, and very neatly following on from that question, really, I was going to ask, really, what's the business model, and do you see Panos, 25 years down the line, 5 years down the line, where are you thinking to go next? Are you looking at working with commercial partners, perhaps? Are these
some agencies have done that, and they've hooked up with camera manufacturers, etc. I mean, I think our business model is one where we see ourselves as being bigger than just a photography agency in working in visual communications as a whole, which is quite a broad church, really. I mean, there's a lot of stuff going on within that where we can help someone, as I said before, help someone get a message out there, and we do that in partnership by looking at, I mean, why do people come to us? Because they think that if we get a story, if we go and shoot a project, we'll be able to place it editorially. I mean, these are the sort of holy grail things, so that we would help with. Maybe it's versioning the work you produce. So you produce a multimedia, maybe you organise an exhibition, you do a book, you do a publication. There's many, many different ways in which you can skin the cat these days. So I think that's what we'll be offering, a greater range of services than we do now. We're beginning to do that anyway. When we go and talk to a client or maybe an NGO, for instance, we're talking not about, oh, let's just go and photograph that project. It's so much more than that. And I think that's where we'll be.
Okay. So a question in the back.
Hi. My name's William Stevens. I'm a painter. And I was just wondering, and actually following on from both of those questions, one of the photographers you featured, the first man who shot the bureaucrats, talked about seeing himself often as almost more of an artist than a photojournalist reportage, and how much is Panos interested in that kind of crossover with fine art?
I think it's a trend within documentary photography anyway, that some of what you might have thought, I mean, for instance, Lana said it's talking about those Afghan photographs and draping things over the camera and all that kind of, it's like a performance. That's, that is straying into the art world. And I think that's part of the result of this changing landscape in photography, that photographers are looking for new ways of funding themselves, so they're going into a gallery environment, which means they then start thinking differently about what they're doing, and what you hang on a wall and what you put on the printed page aren't necessarily the same thing. I mean, Jan's slightly disingenuous because we gave him an assignment only a couple of weeks ago, so yeah, he does get assignments. He likes to think he's an artist, but he lives in Holland. He gets quite large arts grants to produce what he wants to produce. But I definitely think that, but also because we've seen, photojournalism in a way was going down this blind alley of just constantly repeating itself, and you just don't want to be doing that. And I think that the photojournalists that are thinking about their craft and their practice are engaging with other forms of using photography.
I think it's much more complicated than simply saying, I'm going to put my picture in a gallery because that's going to be a way of making some money. And I think Mishka's a great example of that, where, perhaps you want to talk a bit about Mishka's approach, but he's coming up with conceptual ideas that are using photography, even though he's not actually, he's acting as a curator really, rather than as a photographer himself.
Yeah, he's effectively curating. I mean, that's part of the problem with photography, is there's too many pictures being produced, both by photographers and non-photographers on a daily basis. I mean, on a newspaper picture desk, I don't know what the figure is, it's something like 15,000 pictures a day going over the screens, and we just don't need that amount of imagery. And a lot of it, I mean, with Mishka, he's talking about imagery that's produced, there's no human involvement, it's always being produced by machines. Millions of pictures every day, and he's going in there, he's mining it. He's like he's an aggregator, he's finding themes within what's being produced. Which is conceptually interesting, and actually with his No Man's Land, there you've got something produced by an automatic camera on the top of a car, drives up and down roads, and you end up with what looks, to all intents and purposes, like a social documentary photography project.
Yeah, but how do you judge it? I mean, in the end you find that you're judging it by saying, my God, how long has it taken to do that? All that sifting, and you find out you're judging it by
you could do that. It's about the research, and it's about the research. But I think it's a comment about the way in which we engage with the world today. I think that's what he was trying to say. And when he said that, we go back to the web. What do you do? Oh, I need to find something out. I'll Google it. So that's our interface.
I think it'd be interesting with Mishka, because I think if Mishka was not a photographer at all, people probably would respond to the work very differently. They wouldn't critique it as a photographer. Yeah, and that's kind of quite ironic.
Yeah, he's coming for a lot of flack.
Purely a fine artist, they would say, oh, well, that's
you're right.
interesting.
Yeah, you're right.
So I think he's very good to be resisting the fact that, just because he didn't take the pictures doesn't mean that they're not actually interesting, and because he's seeing things that we can't see. I mean, that Harry's point about, pointing at this and not at that is exactly what Mishka's doing. He's pointing our attention to things that would otherwise be invisible.
Hi, Steve Forrest. I want to go back to Paul's point that about your idea that you could actually have people of certain political views to work on the Telegraph. Now, if you take that over to charities, it's impossible to have a different view of a charity and work for a charity. So even though the Telegraph may have an editorial right-wing view, you were sent to places, and Andrew as well, you were sent to places for your eye and for what you saw. Now, what they wrote about it and the bollocks they may have written afterwards is up to them. But we're talking about photography here. Now, the difficulty with charities is there is sorry, Adrian, I'm a member of Panos Pictures as well, but they actually have a really prescribed view of what they want in order to raise funds for a particular project. Now, that will, in my view, I can't help but think that will influence completely the way the photographer works and will get his next or her next commission. There is a very, very different view there. So it's, even though you rely on charities to go to the places that the newspapers won't pay you to go to, you are then required to follow their line. So there's a big compromise, and there's a price that I think people...
Yeah, I agree.
I think that's a very broad statement, because that doesn't apply across the board. There are NGOs that say, we want your vision and don't give you any constraints in the way that you're going to shoot. And there are other ones that have a very, very clear house style, and they say, we want, a flash-lit portrait of a young child looking straight into the camera. And that's
not necessarily technically, but the idea is that you're not, I don't think you're given free rein, I don't think, because journalists are now allowed, don't they rely on them completely for transportation, for everything else now? So isn't that... Sorry, Jen.
No, I mean, I disagree with you on... Is this working?
Yeah.
You're on that, but and I was offered a commission in Congo, which was then rescinded because they decided they wanted Rankin's Celebrity Sparkle, and that was very much, going for a style and looking for a style. But what I think the problem now is contracts, that both on newspapers and working for NGOs, you have to sign on the dotted line, and you can question things and you can add riders, but a lot of the time you have to agree to either losing your copyright, whatever.
Well, that says it all when Rankin's photos are used. And I went to that event at the, I think it was a South Bank, with the glitzy models, and listening to Rankin talk about how he really connected to the people in the refugee camp, and the whole lot was a complete load of bollocks. But it actually did. The charity it was good for its profile. Yeah. They got photographers, camera crews turning up to film Rankin talk about a charity. So that is, in a way, sort of proves my point on that thing.
But he's the Trojan horse, isn't he? That gets them the media coverage, hopefully over and beyond just the fact it's Rankin. But I mean, you're right, some NGOs will they control the message, so, like, they make New Labour look, positively liberal in that respect. I mean, they really are tight on it. But then I think you just have to establish the fact that to be allowed to have your creative freedom. And it's more about the issue than it is about the NGO. That's the other way. I would follow it and say this is about the issue, it's not about the NGO. And the good NGOs, people like MSF, they allow you to produce work which is very much about an issue, and it isn't a bit of puff about MSF. It might at the end say, well, MSF is working in this area or whatever, but it's not this huge advertorial for them.
And before we take this next question, I mean, how much is Panos setting the agenda? How much are you going out to the NGO world and saying, this is the issue we want to cover? Do you want to come with us on this journey?
Yeah, we've looked at issues and thought, we'd like to do it in a particular way, and then found people that are working on those issues. And I have to say that working with them hasn't always been easy. I mean, I'm not going to pretend it is easy, and particularly when you're working with more than one NGO at the same time, because they're both like muscling in there. But yeah, we've been proactive. We've gone out there and said, when we did this big exhibition on slavery, we said we want to do something on the contemporary slave trade, and we want to do it on the slave trade and how it manifests itself in Britain today. And so, we came up with all the creative side, and a lot of the messaging on that came from us.
Great.
Hi, Phil Clark-Hill. I'm a photographer and also a student at Westminster. It's not really a question, it's more of a point. I just wanted to sort of say, carrying on from this, I think that's part of the reason why a lot of photographers have started really taking it upon themselves to fund, like Chloe, to fund projects from corporate work or really boring, or building walls in a gallery or something like that. Or crowdfunding, because they can really have complete free reign on it. And I think in some ways that is part of the shift and why that's happened from the last sort of few years, because and why you've got this change in documentary of people doing things that, they're not doing it for anyone in particular, but then the outlets are picking up on it. And I think it's quite interesting that that's how a lot more really different and unusual projects have started to get covered.
I wouldn't say that's necessarily a new thing. I mean, if you look back, Robert Capa did advertising shoots in the 1950s and made, there was a shoot he did that he made $20,000 in 1949 doing a whiskey ad. $20,000 in 1949 is a shed load of money. So I think, I don't think it's a new thing that photographers have cross-funded their practice from doing commercial work. I think that's been pretty much par for the course right through what we've always done. I think there are some new things like crowdfunding and crowdsourcing and so on. So I think it's you've got to be, it's always quite good to take a bit of a historical perspective sometimes and look back a bit about what has made, what are the real structural changes in the industry and what are kind of
Yeah, but I think it is more of a sort of necessity now as well. Because I think for someone really coming into the industry, it's not, like you said before, it's very unlikely to get an assignment that will give you a fee, let alone cover your costs from a magazine. Sure. So you just have to. And I think there seems like there's a lot more grants and bursaries around and things like that. So.
Question over the back there. And then one. So we'll take this one on the right first, and then we'll go to the back over there. Sorry. Yeah, we'll go to you first, and then to you.
Hi, Nick Jones. It seems there's a less structured career progression in photojournalism now. I was wondering where are future photojournalists coming from? Because we were talking earlier about the technical side of it, and it's getting very much more sort of difficult and there's more to learn. And I mean, the University of the Arts, City University for Journalism in America, I think it's Medill in Northwestern, which is the top one. But students of the future, of course, are going to come out with overdrafts and debts. And do you think the training or the future photojournalists are going to be people? I mean, it seems that Chloe just had a passion and told her own story, but surely students in the future won't have the funds or finances to do that because they'll be graduating with debts to cover before they even start their own funding. So where do you see the training and where do you see the future for photojournalism?
Well, I mean, on our course, the majority of students that come on it have done a first degree in something else. They haven't done a first degree in photography. And they come with a passion for the world and they want to try and tell stories about the world. And that hasn't changed really. I mean, I did a version of the course I teach now 20 years ago at Newport. And I left with, you know, that was a BTEC H&D, which was no funding for that either. So I had my own debts when I left. I don't think that's really changed. I mean, okay, the debts are bigger now, but still, you know, compared to what you might spend doing workshops or on a project, they're still not astronomical. And I think that, you know, I think training or educating yourself or learning is really important all the way through your career. I think that's one thing that possibly photographers don't do enough of once they've graduated. You know, one of the things I've learned through teaching is that you don't stop learning and you don't stop trying to develop your skills and push yourself. And the quote I really love is Todd Papageorge's reworking of Robert Capa's famous, "If your pictures aren't good enough, you're not close enough." And his is, "If your pictures aren't good enough, you're not reading enough." And I think that sense of it's not just about the pictures. It never has been. But really making sure that it's not just about taking photographs, it's about this much broader sense of what am I trying to do, what am I trying to achieve, how do I then collaborate with other people to achieve the end that I want. And I think that's one of the big shifts, that this idea of the kind of, you know, heroic gunslinging photographer with his bag of Tri-X and 2 Leicas going off into the sunset is pretty unrealistic now. And I think most people are working in collaboration with other people and doing projects that are actually, ironically, often much more ambitious and much more complex and much more thought through. I think the old model, you know, when you basically did a magazine assignment and you're really happy with that. Fantastic, I got my pictures in The Guardian, great. And then I give them to my agency and your agency sells them off to some magazine you've never heard of and you've no idea what their politics are on the other side of the planet, but you get a check in the post, as it were. That was actually a pretty simplistic and not very sophisticated model for doing what we want to do, communicating to the world our interests, our passions, and our desires. You know, and I think the model now, where most photographers, I think the work they really care about, they really, really want to be doing it. They're not doing it just because it's an assignment. I think the trap that lots of photographers fell into in the 90s or the 80s, in the golden age, was you were non-stop on assignment, but you were non-stop doing things that you weren't particularly interested in. You know, I think I'd like to think that Panos hasn't been guilty of this, but how many of those big agency projects did you get where, you know, we're going to do a project about X, and we're going to ask all our photographers to participate. Most photographers don't give a fuck about excuse my French, about that particular topic. It just happens to be, we've got a grant, we've got an assignment, I'll go and do that thing. They don't really care about it, not really that interested in it, but it's an assignment, so hell, I'll go and do it. You know? So I think that's one of the shifts now, that most of the people that I see graduating from my course and other courses like it are much clearer about what they want to do and why they want to do it and how they're going to do it than we were a generation ago. It's a bit of a rant, I know. But
I think it's right. You're thinking more about it.
Yeah, and I think that idea that nowadays it's not just about the photographs anymore is really important to think about. Of course it's about the photographs, but it's about a lot more than that. It's about much more about thinking about, you know, who you're working with and why and so on. Anyway, we had a question at the back
there. My name's Perry. I'm a programs officer at the Rory Peck Foundation. My question is less about the future of photography, more seeing as you're not with a media organization, you're not going with a group of journalists, you're probably there as a long-term project. How are you received in a hostile environment by the people you're trying to photograph? Is it always easy to gain access to the subject you're interested in? And how do you then work your way around it to get what you want out of your project?
Has that changed in the last 10, 15 years, the relationship between you and your subject, or their relationship to you?
Not really. I mean, when you're living in a place, obviously, I mean, it's helpful if you learn the local language. I mean, you can either get around using a fixer, or if you know the language, if you picked up the language, you can get around. But I mean, for me, the really important thing in covering the war was the relationship between the people who are directly affected by it. The people who have no choice, who are the civilians. I mean, the soldiers have a choice, all the armies have a choice, but there was the people who are affected by the war. They have no choice. Their lives have been destroyed and interrupted. Obviously, in the Balkans, you always had the problem with the basic thing was if you boil it down, the Albanians, they got the idea of cooperating with the media. The Serbs did not. The Serbs hated you because you're English. They hated you. They hated Americans. So it was always very difficult to get in with the Serbs because of nationality. But you use little tricks. I used to say I was Scottish or Welsh, or it worked sometimes it didn't. But when you're in a place, you kind of worked out. If you said you were French, that's fine because the French get on well with the Serbs. When you're in a place, you work out the little idiosyncrasies. I mean, that what language to speak when you stop at a checkpoint. I mean, that's the sort of stuff you pick up when you're based somewhere and you get to know it, because that can be very, very important. What you say when you get to a checkpoint. Do you say mirdita or stravo? That can be that can be really bad if you say the wrong one. And Kate Adie did say the wrong one time when she went in Kosovo. She went to the Serbs and then said hello in Albanian. Luckily she had a huge cameraman who protected her. But so I mean, you pick up that when you're living in a place.
Great. We've got time for two more questions maybe. So one at the back there, and then for anybody else who's got a.
Katie Harrison, also from Tearfund. We've heard you mention a lot that there isn't the time or money to do the things that you are really passionate about, generally as photographers. I wondered what those things are and what you think the great untold stories might be out there that you would love to get.
So what's your great untold story, Andrew?
I don't know if there is a great untold story. I think I think the media, when it goes into a conflict situation or anything, it's and a lot with the British media is very superficial. It's there for a little while, and then UN's here. Okay, let's all fuck off to the next one. I mean, but life isn't like that, and stories continue. The untold story is that wars and conflicts don't just start and stop. They go on for a long, long, long time. 20 years now since Bosnia, and Bosnia is still a complete mess. It's a disaster. Macedonia now is war 10 years ago, still the same problems. Kosovo, war 13 years ago, still the same problems. The untold story is that the story doesn't stop, and that's kind of by staying with the subject and photographing it and keep on coming back to it, you can hopefully understand it better and present it so that people can then spark some interest.
What's your untold story?
What's my untold story? Good question.
This is not a kind of self-help thing.
No, I know. No, I agree that the more profound stories is the things that's what you don't have time and money for. And so to sort of keep going back to something, and when you think perhaps you've finished it, or perhaps you've got some sort of story that is able to be published, that actually perhaps to look at it again. And I mean, I think also a lot of the time it's the stories that are very close to you as well. And I'm working on a piece now based in Britain along the Thames, and I'm constantly finding new things that are as exciting as when I was in that Caspian region, and I think that all those sorts of stories are the stories that I'm sort of focusing on at the moment. Yeah.
Great. Anybody else got any last questions? Okay. Well, sorry. Go on then.
I was just wondering, really to Chloe, you talked about when you went to China and you turned up and you were hitchhiking. I was just wondering how much of an idea you had about what you wanted to photograph, or was it literally just going there and the sort of the serendipity of finding something? And
I think that I did a certain amount of research beforehand, but I was quite keen to keep as open as possible, because it was an incredibly luxurious trip. Obviously you can't always do that sort of thing. So rather than going on this trip where I had all these clear ideas, which is much more sort of assignment way of going in somewhere and shooting something that you're going to do, my whole idea was to try and just talk to people. So for example, I had seen in the China context, I had seen stuff in the press and I'd been reading about it, But I certainly didn't think I was going to shoot anything about that necessarily. But then when I got there, it was everywhere I looked, you know. It was everyone was talking to me about it, and it felt, for that reason, that I wanted to shoot a piece about it.
Okay, I'll take one last question from
Hi, I'm Fabian, I'm a photographer. Chloe, I was just wondering, did you speak Chinese or Russian or both when you did the project?
No, but my boyfriend who I was with speaks Russian, so that was really helpful. And I was learning Russian and still am. Keen CD user. But yeah, I think that's really important if you can. I mean, the most that you can do, obviously. I mean, I wasn't fluent, but every single bit helps, I find.
Thanks.
So maybe Adrian has a last comment. When you're looking for new photographers, and I'm not saying that you are, but what are the essential qualities, do you think, of a Panos photographer?
To know a good story. I mean, that's really important, to understand about how to put a good story together, how to just, I mean, we've just been talking actually in the office this week, because we're having a photographers meeting where we're going to pitch our photographers' stories to a collection of clients. And you look at these pictures and you just think, you know, that it's something that's missing a lot of the time, is just that ability to be able to hone in and very clearly say, right, this is the story I want to tell, this is what it's about. I mean, you wouldn't think it's that difficult, but actually it is quite difficult, particularly when you're surrounded. And I think people can, you know, I don't know, what can you take, say, the Arab Spring? I mean, lots of people going to cover the Arab Spring. But do I know a whole lot more about the Arab Spring by looking at all the photographers that come out of there? If I see 50,000 pictures of Tahrir Square, do I know more about the Arab Spring because of that? The answer is no. That is not what I want them to do, to go there and just take pictures of crowds in Tahrir Square. I want them to think about what is the essential elements of this story and how can I tell it, by approaching it probably from a roundabout route. I mean, that's you know, and it doesn't have to be a history lesson or educational. It can be just very simple. Just the simplest ideas work the best.
Great. So let's hope there's another 25 years of simple roundabout storytelling. Great. Thank you very much, everybody.
Get rid of this.
Well done.
Thank you.